Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. I'm so glad to be with you today as we commemorate the life, works, and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on what is the 56th anniversary of his assassination, of his murder. Please join us on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Like and subscribe there. Like and subscribe. Tell everybody about us. Click that bell so that when we come up live, you will be notified. The Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. And meet me on X at Santita J, at Santita J. And we're also streaming on the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. No place else but Santita Jackson and Friends. Oh, and Reverend Jesse Jackson's page as well. We're sharing that with him. We want to talk about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a revolutionary. He was a radical. When he was killed, he was about the most hated man in the United States of America. It's hard to believe now. But when you think of President Reagan and the slight aside that he gave him as he signed the legislation that enacted the Martin Luther King holiday. And when someone mentioned that he was a communist, he said, well, we have heard that, haven't we? That was a slight aside. When Dr. King was living, in the last few years of his life, he could not get in pulpits, most of them black. He could not get in pulpits. And he had a more than 55% disapproval rating in the black community. More than 70% of white Americans disapproved of him. April 4th, 1967, 6 p.m., just after 6 p.m., after much contemplation, he walked to the pulpit at the Riverside Church and gave his anti-war speech. And at the conclusion, Reverend Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, his chief of staff, who went on to become an iconic minister himself, he walked up to him and said, Martin, you know you've just signed your death warrant. And Dr. King said, I know. But this was the right thing to do. So what about that? Who was this man? Why was the state so afraid of him? And why was he killed a year to the day, to the minute, from the moment that he announced his opposition to the war? Desegregating America, he could do that. But when he came up against this military-industrial complex, when he talked about restructuring our society, he became the most dangerous man in America. I'm so glad that you stayed with the state representative from Wisconsin, Lakeisha Myers. I'm glad that you felt that it was important enough for you to be here. From the Poor People's Campaign of Illinois, Sheila Garland. When I asked you if you would participate, you said an emphatic yes, 3 exclamation points. Reverend Dr. Todd Urey, Esquire, from the National Leadership Team of Rainbow Push, and the senior pastor of the iconic Douglas Memorial Community Church in Baltimore, Maryland. Dwight McKee, of course, one of the founders of Operation Push. He worked with Reverend Jackson. Reverend Jackson was your youth pastor at Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church, one of the few pulpits in the United States where Dr. King was allowed to preach, welcomed into the pulpit. And they made our pastor, Reverend Clay Evans, pay by not allowing him to build his church for almost a decade, Pastor Hagler. And of course, he's with the National Action Network. He is also the senior advisor to the Cornel West campaign. And we welcome one of the icons of our struggle. I mean, there are a lot of people who say that they did the work, but this is one of the persons who has actually done the work, and we are indebted to you for the rest of our days for all of the work that you've done, Pastor Raylan Hagler, the pastor emeritus of the Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. And Faith Strategies, you're the chair of that, but you've done so much work, saved so many souls, and you've really helped to change America and all of our life options. I welcome you back to the show, Pastor Hagler.
Thank you so much.
You've taken great pains to remind us that Dr. King was a radical. Why?
Well, because the Martin King that we talk about in the culture today is not really the essence of the man, the preacher, the theologian. They've taken him and they've created an homogenization of King, smooth out the rough edges, take away the prophetic tone, make sure that somehow all of the economics that Dr. King talked about is no longer a part of who he is, that his anti-war speech is no longer a part of the national narrative. They simply talk about, can we all just get along? As if somehow that is the essence of who Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was and what he talked about. When you read the speech at the Riverside Church, he says, unless we deal with this kind of issue of America being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, that we'll be going to marches forever. Mozambique, South Africa. He names those things. Here we are today, scared to speak out around the genocide that's going on in Palestine because we're afraid that we might be ostracized. So again, truth takes a back seat, and we are afraid to speak out and to be bold in our prophetic message. Dr. King spoke out. And what happened was that the poll numbers, as you know, and pointed out, Santita, dropped. They plummeted. I remember my father saying, why didn't he stick to civil rights? Very upset that he had talked about the war in Vietnam. But as he said, how could he continue to speak out against nonviolence here at home if he didn't speak out about the violence that was being perpetuated by this nation around the world, and particularly at that point in Southeast Asia? That made him radical. But really, it's not radical at all. That made him true to the prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power and speaking truth when it's not even popular, but telling folks what they need to hear, what they need to contemplate, and what they need to understand. So that's the radical nature of Dr. King.
And yet we're so far away from him now. We talk about his dream instead of looking at the first part of the speech in which he said, I've come to you, Washington, D.C., because your check bounced on me. And I refuse to believe that the vaults of opportunity are empty in America. I mean, why is it we're so uncomfortable? And people, when you bring that up to them, they say his dream was for all of us to get along. No, was it that simple, Pastor Hackler?
Well, that's why folks are trying to rewrite history. That's why they don't want us to talk about the historical moments in U.S. history and in world history where people of color were betrayed, where people of color were exploited. They want a can't we all get along narrative that somehow leaves out civil rights, that leaves out Jim Crow, that leaves out enslavement in America or the Caribbean or South America, or leaves out the Haitian Revolution, for example. All of these things to make history what our exploiters want history to be, rather than what history actually is.
Would you say that's the same thing that happened with the overtaking of Christianity? When Constantinople took it over.
And we've been dealing with that ever since. Things like prosperity theology.
Mm-hmm.
Don't want to talk about the issues. This right-wing white evangelicalism that even want to entertain a despot as the second coming of Christ. I mean, how crazy can you get? How off course can you steer the ship? And right now, we're in a place where there is great insanity that's not only gripping the nation, but gripping the world.
What do we say to our young people about him now? I mean, how misunderstood is he today, Pastor Hackler?
I think it's very misunderstood. I remember going to a class, high school class, this a number of years ago, to speak about King. And I remember one of the kids raised his hand, and this was the quote I shall never forget. He went, "What the F is Martin Luther King? He ain't put no money in my pocket."
Wow.
Because, what has been taught has been an image that America and the empire can live with, rather than who and what and how radical and revolutionary the ideology and the theology of King, just how revolutionary it was.
Mm. Dwight McKee, you witnessed Dr. King's campaign in Chicago, the Fair Housing campaign, and really he came in to do so much. And he was virtually run out of town. Dwight McKee?
Yeah, he was virtually run out of town, and mostly by black preachers.
Mm.
Is that in Chicago? Chicago was particular in that they had Mayor Daley as a mayor who had a lot of the black preachers under his thumb, and he threatened them in such a way as that they had to be morally neutral when it came to, radical issues. And Dr. King was dealing with radical issues. Chicago then was the most segregated city in the world. And Dr. King, because of that, it being so segregated, it had piled black people on top of each other, on top of each other, on top of each other. And Dr. King came in with Al Raby to deal with open housing. That is, that we need uh, options in places that we can live, which upset white people in the city because they didn't want any black people in their proximity. And so it was a situation that had to implode upon itself. And so he began to have demonstrations in the white community for open housing, which brought the worst of out of the white people who was totally against that. And so ultimately, Daley forced him to pretty much have to leave town and took the black ministers and used them as a tour de force to force him to leave. Only a couple of black preachers allowed him to preach in their pulpits. Thurston and Clay Evans and Hardy, and just a couple of them maintained their moral integrity at that point in time.
And what price did they pay?
Well, it depended on the preacher. Clay Evans paid the price if they wouldn't allow him to build his church for 10 years. Um, the head of the black, the National Baptist Convention, who was here at the time, he was so anti Dr. King that he changed, when Dr. King got assassinated, he changed the address of his church so it would not be on Dr. King Boulevard.
They
Reverend
moved it.
Jackson, Dr. Jackson.
You had to move from, they moved it from the front door, which faced King Drive, to the side door.
It
Oh,
was just a radical. And Dr. King, got an apartment on the west side of Chicago, which was really kind of revolutionary at its time. But it was also volatile, and it created for Daley a real problem that that ultimately played out in the form of Operation Breadbasket, and those remaining ministers been involved in that were Reverend Jesse Jackson, and that became a thorn in Daley and the administration side for the next 40, 50 years.
so Pastor Hackler, that's why you're saying this was the king you knew, and this is the king we don't know. So when you have this child who, bless his child's heart, in their ignorance, they don't know that, so many of our leadership today are really establishment figures. They really do go along and get along. We're excited about them because they're the first this, the first that. but they're not giving us the deliverables that our historical Black leadership has done, who came out of the church, right? Or-
Well, yeah. I mean, we don't see the image of the revolutionary.
Mm.
Revolutionary that had to tear up systems and tear down systems and break through walls. You know, that's why I always say when I preach, I said, ain't no black person a conservative. If you're conservative, that means you don't know history and you don't love yourself. Because the whole nature of being black in this world meant you had to tear down the systems and open up the doors. You're not trying to conserve anything. It's a continued progressive movement. Even right now, if we come back to it, it's defending the gains we made and trying to push even further. That's where we are because we are really part of the system only to the degree that we've made the system bend toward justice, and we're still having to push it. And therefore, we get mixed up very often in our ideology where we want to be a part of the power brokers rather than the Nathans who was able to remind David that he messed up, to remind the system that it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. We're still called to be the Amoses that demand that justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We're to be that, and to do that, I've sat in service after service, hearing preachers talk less and less about justice, less and less about the radical demands of the gospel, and more about money, more and more about material possessions. Again, they have lost the passion and the power of the gospel. In King, we have to embrace the revolutionary nature of the man in order to really understand him and to really understand. I mean, your father, Santita, very much stood in that stream and continued to push all of us and make the system conform to justice and to be hopeful. That's the power of that old message. And that's what we're called to do. And if we do anything less, we fail.
Mm. And Sheila, you're in that tradition with Reverend Dr. William Barber for the Poor People's Campaign, which
Yeah.
was the last great campaign of Reverend Jackson. Of course, Reverend Hagley, you remember, Reverend Jackson was the director of Resurrection City when they had the sit-in on the mall. Thousands of people. That was the whole point. And they were going to sit in until the war on poverty was revived. And of course, at the top of that was Reverend Dr. David Abernathy. Um, and you've picked up the baton today. What should we know? How can we function in Dr. King's legacy today? So many of us really do not know that he was so hated. And if we listen to him today, Reverend Hagler, we wouldn't like him today either. We really wouldn't, Sheila.
Yeah. You know, you know, as I was very young. I remember the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was in the 8th grade in Flint, Michigan, and we decided to leave school. And here we are, 8th graders. We had the police called on us because we had gathered in the hallway to mourn, the assassination, the murder. I didn't know all the details of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And there was even in the Flint community, one, which had a very radical underpinning, as folks know, the Flint sit-down strike. We were one of the first cities to organize our counselors and teachers and those sorts of things on the backs of that remarkable sit-down strike in 1936-37. And so the tradition of Martin Luther King, as I learned it, was from a set of very revolutionary folks in and around Flint, and then also in my travels, education, over the decades. And so I've come to know and understood him to be a revolutionary from my beginnings of studying him and trying to understand who he was in the radical tradition that brought us through so many periods of radicalized understanding so that we could. And I always say this, I know I'm kind of like a broken machine, but that brought us to the Black Reconstruction, that brought us to the Civil Rights Movement, that where you did have, for example, in Detroit, I don't know if folks knew this, but there was a young Black radical who was the head of the Detroit Revolutionary Union movement, General Gordon Baker, who was the first one to send his letter to say that I'm not going off to fight against some brown people in Vietnam. I don't have anything against them. I'm oppressed in my own country. And he served time in prison. So there was a lot of consciousness, and a lot of that was at the same time that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was, was leading up to this radical message of, we have to end poverty. At the time when Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about this radical need to end poverty and to really point out empire, there were about 40 million poor and low income people in this country from the statistics that I remember from back then. Today there are over 140 million poor and low income people in this country. So that number is increasing in a ridiculously radical amount. And we have to realize, I mean, I know I always say this, I always say that the solutions to the issues of poverty and war, certainly lie with our unity. And the more that the powers that be sanitize and deconstruct and de-radicalize Martin Luther King means that we lose an important touchstone for our own historical understanding and situation about who we are and where we come from in that tradition. And so I think it's very deliberate, the sanitation, as Reverend Hagler was saying, of Martin Luther King and his radical tradition. I was just on a call the other night, and a young, well, he's older now. He was from the South. He grew up in Alabama. And he said, where I grew, he's white. His name is Tani, Reverend Tani. And he said, where I grew up, if you said anything about integration or questioned war or anything, you were immediately characterized as a communist. And anything, and communism, the red baiting is the most effective tool that the ruling class in this country utilize in order to guarantee that we don't have that the kind of unity that we need. And our paths crossed back in the day because I went to school in Alabama. But this moniker of communism has always been a red herring, that we're now divided ideologically about something that is fundamentally where we're headed, I think, in the stream of history. We have to put humanity and the earth first. And that means that we have to have a radical revolutionary reconstruction of this country. Because if we don't do it in this country, it's going to be really impossible for other nations to throw off the yoke of the United States. I mean, so we have a really burdensome task in this country to begin to come together. And I know I've mentioned this. I mean, I think I was reading, my mind is kind of in a couple of different places, but there's this dissertation by John Rice, who was a professor here for years. He's since retired, about the Illinois Black Panther Party. But he does a deep dive study into the social and political conditions leading up to the Black Panther Party and its demise. And he talks very deeply about the period of time when Dr. Martin Luther King came to Chicago and the conditions that existed at that time. I mean, we're talking about a city government that was run by thugs and gangsters. They were not above, they murdered many politicians, black politicians, outright use the police to just murder. You know this history. Santita murdered folks in the streets of this city. This is what Dr. Martin Luther King walked into. So there was fear because you didn't know if you were going to be the next one up on the leaderboard to get murdered. So I mean, it's not just I don't want to say that not standing up is not what folks should do, but I also want to put it in context that people's lives were expendable, as we all know, during that time. And we can recount the numbers of folks from that radical movement that time that were murdered and killed and harassed and all of that. I mean, and the threats on people's lives. It's very chilling. But we continue to fight in spite of that. So the campaign, that the Poor People's Campaign that was resurrected in 2018 is such an important resurrection, because unless we build that unity from the very bottom of society, the 140 million plus, who I keep saying who need change, we're going to constantly be operating in our own silos, where the things that Dr. Martin Luther King talked about in a very radical way. I mean, he actually said, I wish I knew the quote off, verbatim, Reverend Hagel, you probably know it, but don't look at white person, don't look at that black person, that Negro next to you, and vice versa, because your conditions are the same. We have to become that new and unsettling force that can change the national narrative of this country and really talk about changing those structures that can lift the load of poverty for everybody. And so to me, that's not just a radical message from the 1960s, but it's a necessary message today.
Mm-hmm. But it is, State Representative Myers, it's a radical message today. You're in the Wisconsin State Legislature.
Oh my goodness.
If you talk about wanting to feed people, that is a radical message today, or am I misreading this?
No, it is a radical message today. I've been sitting here taking notes based on what everybody was saying. When you look at this from what Pastor Hagler was talking about, when you look at the sanitization of the Martin Luther King that we had in my day, I'm gonna say in my day in elementary school, because I wasn't there. I was not alive when Martin Luther King was assassinated. I born in 84. So, we get to school. It's like, oh, well, we're going to tell you about Martin Luther King today. He had a dream and he wanted everybody to get along and we want everybody to hold hands. And this is great. But then
that's all you know.
Right. That's the part that you get taught at school. Now, at my house, I got taught the other side of that. Let me tell you the story about open housing. Let me talk to you about what he did, in Mississippi, where my parents are from, talking about all of these things. So I got the other side of that. So when I went back to school and asked questions, it was like, well, we want to talk about they wanted to talk about like the whole civil rights movement. And I've learned this even with being a teacher. When we train other teachers, it's like, oh, slavery, then a whole thing about a bus, and then Martin Luther King, and then when he died, it was all great. There is so many. No, that is not how that goes. And a lot of people will put that timeline in place and they go from here to there to that and say, oh, well, that was it. It all kind of it went away when Dr. King died. No, it didn't. Because the conditions that Sheila is talking about still exist. We wouldn't have a fight for 15 or even need to have a fight for 15 or talk about people that have tipped wage and trying to end tipped wage in the United States because of all of the things that happened during Dr. King's time and before that. Those were the things, the economic policy of Dr. King. Like, I think there are sometimes, and I know I'm looking at Reverend Hagler when I say this, when you talk about absolution and forgiveness, two different things. I think there's this idea that folks have like, oh, well, it happened, we sorry, and now we just need to move on. But you still are stuck with the policy implications. So you can't just move on. Move on to what is what we're asking. Move along to what? So now you're still dealing with issues of racial segregation. Dwight talked about Chicago being one of the most segregated cities in the United States. I'm from Milwaukee, just up the street, still segregated today. Still segregated today. At least y'all had a black suburb in Illinois. We ain't never had that. So, just to even try to get open housing and be able to live where you want to live. We got people today who will not accept Section 8 and rent assistance for people who need it to live in certain suburbs around the city of Milwaukee. We're still dealing with the policy implications that Dr. King was talking about, maybe not in the exact form, but they're still the reiterations of the same issues that he was talking about, trying to alleviate back then, still in 2024. When you talk about, like I said, ending tipped wage or even looking at minimum wage, there is no way on God's green earth the minimum wage should still be $7.25 in the United States of America in 2024, when the cost of bread is probably $5. So that does not make sense. So why are we all of these things still exist? You talked about looking at communism. Communism was the red herring that Sheila talked about. That, oh, if you say that, oh, you must be a communist, you must be a socialist, you want to, have, distribution of wealth, all of these things. Well, today, if you say anything and speak out against certain wars, Reverend Hagler, you get looked at like an anti-Semite. Ask me how I know. So, you have to deal with all of these things. They are just reiterations of the same issues that we're dealing with when Dr. King was around. So I think understanding and teaching people the depth that was Dr. King, even from the religious front. When I think about what Pastor Hagler talked about, and I know, Dwight talked about this with Reverend Jackson changing the face of his church, the splits that happened in the National Baptist Convention, we're still reeling from some of that. I'm a Baptist. We still reeling from some of those things.
That's how you got the progressive.
That's how we got the Progressive Baptist Convention. Exactly. So all of that. And then you think about what happened in the 90s when full gospel broke off from us too. So all of that is still an issue when you look at how, I don't really like this part, so I'm going to do this. And then these people can't get along. But when you talk about taking away and breaking down power structures, who funded the civil rights movement? Mostly Black churches, right?
They're the power. That's what that's what kept them free. I mean, which gives me
and you could host your conference at an A.G. Gaston motel or at some Black-owned entity, and now all of us go run around to these white folks' hotels right now every summer. When you go to the Urban League, the NAACP, AKAs, everybody else, we all run and go to somebody else's city, and don't none of us own the hotel.
Well, you know what?
Economic power, you have to start thinking about that part too.
Well, I mean, and that's what keeps us free, Reverend Dr. Yeary. I mean, because indeed you're part of the 1,000, this coalition of 1,000 pastors who said to President Biden, if you don't come up with a ceasefire, we will not support you. And the New York Times, it was very interesting reading that article. They said your congregants pushed you to that. Said, no. You tell him, no ceasefire, no vote. And that is, and I know that I'm sure that every church is not signed on, because there are more than 1,000 Black churches in the United States, Pastor Yeary.
There are. Let's put this in a context. One, the affinity to Dr. King posthumously is a reminder that white hostility was not the only hostility that Dr. King had to confront. Black indifference, Black accommodationism, sometimes even Black paranoia about what might happen to them if they spoke out, was an issue and continues to be an issue. I would almost argue that if Dr. King were to be alive today and able to do at some level what a man of his age might be able to do, would be more hated now than he was then. Because at the end of the day, we would rather be accepted by white people than respected by white people. Mm-hmm. Dr. King was placing a demand of respect on the table. And so when we deal with these isms, it wasn't just Dr. King dealing with militarism, materialism, racism. He was also dealing with historical revisionism. One of the things I remember in seminary when we studied some of Dr. King's writings from his days at Boston University, where he was writing his PhD, was this impugning of his reputation that somehow or other his writings might have been plagiarized. Where have we heard this story most recently?
Mm.
Whenever there's a challenge to white power structures, there's an assault on the credibility of the one raising the challenges. And so Dr. King challenged revisionism. He confronted populism, even black populism. Let's go along to get along. It may not be what we want it to be, but it ain't that bad. It's like, all right, I'll take carbon monoxide because I can't tell it's killing me. But the minute I realize I'm sleepy, I'm dead. And so this notion that somehow or other we're afraid to have this conversation, Dr. King's name raises a lot of angst. And it ain't just for white folks, it's for black folks too. The Progressive National Baptist Convention, of course, is a thing because J.H. Jackson just felt like he was too problematic for the National Baptist Convention at that time. And so when we consider where we are, I think we have to remember that Dr. King raised for us the power of what we might call divine discontent. It's a term he raised at a speech in St. Louis in 1954. That there are some folks who only know how to look back. But then there's always a core group, maybe a handful of folks who know how to look forward and talk about things as they ought be, not as the way they once were, as if we're somehow trying to deal with incrementalism as the way of dealing with our problems. And the way I frame this is I have this personal reminder of just what that meant. Because back during COVID, when you weren't supposed to get on an airplane, you weren't supposed to go publicly, I had to go down to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Alabama Bar Association to meet with the character and fitness board because I had applied for admission to practice in Alabama, of all places. When you go into the Alabama Bar Association and you come out the door, there is a stark image in front of you because across the street to the left is a little red brick church that stands in the shadows of the state capitol. That red brick church is Dexter Avenue. And when you stand with that perspective, while the size is distinct, that the Capitol is much larger. We confuse power with size. We confuse force with numbers. And Dr. King brought the credibility of the force of divine discontent to the moment that allowed us to really, if we didn't embrace it, we've certainly benefited from it. The question is, what will we do with it now? Because as Reverend Hagler pointed out at the very beginning, we are ominously close to a kind of revisionism and descendancy back into the abyss of a white racist structure that is so overtly hostile now without any checks and balances to raise the issue of what will we do and who will say about it now. And so the question is not how do we feel about Dr. King, it's who's going to speak up now. We have an example. We don't have an excuse now. And if you're going to use Dr. King as the example, you don't raise Dr. King's name if you're trying to make friends. You raise Dr. King's name when you're trying to make change. And that's really the ultimate question before us on this anniversary of his assassination. We are, remember the mountaintop speech, right? I may not get there with you, but we will get to the promised land. I would simply say if Dr. King was here, he would tell us this ain't it. So don't stop moving. We got more work to do. We've got more traveling to achieve, and we've got more fighting to put forth. And so with that in mind, I use it to reflect upon the relevance and the credibility of the work that I and my colleagues are called to do, because we don't have an excuse now. We have a Dr. King as a model, and we ought to make sure that we build upon that model so that the generation that comes after us doesn't just have to rely on somebody's interpretation of what Dr. King did at some point in time. There is a body of work that builds upon the credibility of his witness that then inspires the generations yet unborn to continue the fight until justice does indeed run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Pastor Hagler, where are we today when you look at 1968 and when you look at 2024? I mean, we've had so many firsts. I think we've made a lot of giant steps forward, but then we've made some steps backward. I mean, where are we?
Well, first of all, I just want to say amen to everybody that's on this panel, because you're so clear in terms of your perspective. I want to thank you. Thank God for each of you. Where we are right now is in a terrible state. We don't want to deal with the issue of white supremacy that was an issue then and still is, that permeates the culture. And in a sense, we want to make it comfortable. We want to, in a sense, find a way to fit ourselves into it. But the reality is, it is a phenomenon that is still alive in this country, but not only in this country, around the world. That's the struggle right now of darker people against this whiplash of white supremacy. Whether you're talking about Palestine, Israel, whether you talk about what's going on right now in Haiti, whether you talk about what are the vestiges of colonialism on the continent of Africa, that's our struggle, is to dismantle, is to face white supremacy and engage in the deliberate dismantling of it, challenging of it. Where are we in terms of talking about what reparations look like? White folks got reparations. When everybody talk about in DC, for example, that was the first in the nation to get rid of the institution of slavery. And it was, except they paid the slave master for his slaves. Reparations. The debt against Haiti that they had to pay for being free was white man's reparations. Right now, in this MAGA's ideology, is an attempt at white man's reparations. He ain't got nothing he's owed for, but he believes he is, because he believes that they've been replaced by people of color in this nation. There's this idea of replacement theory that is permeated throughout Europe and is very much alive here in the US. That's why this despot who's running for president can talk about immigrants poisoning our blood and make a mention about how many Haitians and Africans they are. Again, that's our struggle, is to dismantle it, is to challenge it, is to not shrink away from it, to really be deliberate and analytical in how we discuss it and the ways in which we challenge it. Look at what has happened in terms of affirmative action at schools. Again, reparations for white folks, right? And to make sure that white folks have privilege and can maintain privilege. And that's always at the expense of Black people and people of color. So our challenge is to continue to organize around these issues and to not shrink away from the hard language that people don't want to hear. I was talking to a 9-year-old, and they were telling me that they had studied, just like been pointed out earlier, Martin Luther King in school. And I said, "What did you learn?" And the 9-year-old girl told me that he was against bullying. To some degree, that's correct. But that's really diminishing who and what King is and was. And again, that's what we're up against. So our challenge is this: we've grown comfortable. We think that the battle is over because we can go to a bank and get ripped off on a loan. We think that because we have trinkets, that somehow we've come over and gotten through. The reality is, it's very precious what we have. And it came out of a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. I said to Plymouth recently that I'm sick and tired of them talking about Black History Month. Why? Because they're talking about Black U.S. History Month in terms of really folks in the status quo. They haven't talked about liberation struggles in Africa or the Caribbean, things that we're related to, or liberation struggles here in the U.S. that are not on the table in terms of acceptability. We got to talk about that and begin to re-educate people to what the struggle is all about.
How do we do that today? Got about 5 minutes here.
Well, one of the things, I'll say this very quickly, the churches should be your grassroots academy that is talking about those things every week, every Sunday. Unfortunately, many of us came out of schools where our own theology and ideology has been colonialized. So we got to work on decolonializing ourselves in order to teach a radical and liberation history to our people.
I've got about 30 seconds for everyone to close, and then Pastor, I want you to close us out prayerfully. Sheila Garland, 30 seconds.
Yeah, there's a lot that I would like to say. I mean, I am reminded of reading Walter Rodney when I was very young. Walter Rodney talked about how Europe underdeveloped Africa,
Mhm.
and it really struck me, to really understand the economic relations that go into creating the colonialism, the white supremacy, and all these things that we're talking about today. But from my perspective and from the things that I'm seeing and understanding about what's happening in the economy today, and also just coming from Flint, I have to say, we're at a tipping point in terms of where we're going to go in this country. I think that if we do want to get rid of white supremacy, we have to talk about the structures of capitalism, because
Mhm.
white supremacy is inherent. It goes hand in hand with the oppression and exploitation of people here, but also around the globe. So I think we really have to talk about, that those kinds of structures, that this system represents the ideology. We're some of the most propagandized people on the face of the earth. So,
Yeah,
there's a lot to unpack there.
a lot to unpack, and we have to continue to do that because indeed Dr. King was talking about those structures as just, well, that's when they killed him. State representative before you become a state senator and other things.
From your
State
mouth to God's
representative.
ear.
Well, that's right. Let God use you. State representative, Wisconsin State Representative Lakeisha Myers, 30 seconds.
I would just like to say that I am thankful for being able to be a part of this conversation today, because it has reaffirmed the truth that is and that was present with Dr. King, from being able to be here with Dr. Yuri, with Ms. Garland, and with Reverend Hagler, to have the ability to have wisdom and say, I'm on the right path.
Mhm.
If I can keep up and make sure that I have the totality of a Dr. King, informing decisions that I have to make today, on a policy perspective. So I would say that, and I would say to any younger person that did not have the fortune to hear a Dr. King live, or to be engaged with him in any way, to go back and actually read the words of the man himself, because what you get in a textbook from any textbook writer is not going to be enough. It's not going to
Absolutely.
be enough for you to actually understand Dr. King. So read Where Do We Go From Here? Go back, even with Letter from a Birmingham Jail, read
Mhm.
all of the things that Dr. King wrote. He
That's
left
right.
a roadmap, of his thoughts behind. So it's here for us to actually read. So we have to study to show ourselves approved to actually live.
Absolutely. And he told us we'd be here. Reverend Yuri, 30.
I often think about the prominent question: if we were to die today, who would be aware that we had died? Would our death matter? If there's no one to say that your death is relevant, then your life certainly wasn't relevant at all. And so we have to be serious about what we do with the time that we have. Dr. King may have wanted to live a long life. He did what he could with the time that he had. That now falls to us. That mantle is now our assignment. Where do we go from here? It only matters if we're clear on where we are now.
Reverend Graylin Hagler, Pastor Emeritus of the Plymouth Congregational United Church of Washington, D.C., who reminds us that this was a radical man. This was a man of his time and for all time. The last 2 minutes belong to you.
I am also senior advisor to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is one of the organizations that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King belonged to. And let me just say this, because I think it's important for us to contemplate that the anniversary of his murder is more important than the anniversary of his birth. Because the anniversary of his murder points out exactly how he shook the system and to the depths that he shook that system. You know, I used to have a friend that used to say, no cross, no crown. And it's a lifting up again that very prophetic tradition that we run away from. We talk about prophets, we don't mean Profit. We mean the other kind of prophet, the one that shakes us at our core, makes us examine ourselves and whether we are worthy and whether what we are doing is worthy, causing us to reflect on our relationship with our fellow human being, whether we have treated our fellow human being with a spirit of justice, or has it only been about us? Again, those are the things that we find in this prophetic tradition, that we got to reach beyond ourselves. 2016, I was in the Ada refugee camp in Palestine, and they asked me to dedicate a monument to a young man that had been killed by Israeli snipers while playing soccer in the streets. And I did. And to my surprise, on that same monument was the young man who had been killed in the street. And also the young brother who had been killed in Cleveland, Ohio, at the hands of police. And what I'm getting at is that we got to remember that that edge of making a difference and stating the difference extends beyond ourselves. It is really universal. This call for justice, universal for this call for hope. And that's what we got to engage in, is embracing all the struggles around the world, which Reverend Jesse Jackson did and has done, because they are part of our struggle in dismantling white supremacy.
And which you have done. And I thank you for all of that work that you have done. We are forever in your debt. And we thank you for your prophetic example.
Bless you.
Thank you, Pat. No, bless you.
Bless
And
you.
thank you for blessing us. Sending you so much love. Thinking of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King today, everybody. He lives, he lives, he lives.
Amen.
He is more relevant today than ever before. Long live Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. God bless you, everybody.
Bless you, dear.